Welcome to the Dry Club, where we attempt to put nuance back in the news. I'm Brian Henderson, and joining me today, as always, are Josh Bagley and Mario Mascaro. In today's episode, we'll be discussing freedom of speech online in Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act.
So the first topic we want to cover with this audience we have is really what to do with social media, right? This question has been at the forefront of the minds of lawmakers and concerned citizens since roughly 2015. It's been highlighted by contentious hearings in Congress with the CEOs of social media companies. This question is underpinned by several problems. The first problem is, how do we guarantee free speech in an age where the public square is owned by private enterprise? How do we regulate social media companies in such a way that we don't damage an industry that has become one of the cornerstones of the US GDP? And should speech on social media be protected? Where's the trade-off in responsibility between content creator and owner? So tackling the first one, I'll throw it over to you, Mario, to start. Uh, is social media a public square, and should it be treated as a public square?
So that is an enormously difficult question. My own response to this is really no. I think it's the legal precedent on this is very clear that any sort of privately owned forum is by definition not a public square. So the legal distinction there is really critical, and what that means basically is that your content owner, the platform itself, which I suppose is not the content owner, the platform itself can make the kinds of distinctions that we have seen very recently with companies like Twitter, Facebook, even Amazon, right? And while this may seem, well, no, I'll even take that back. Obviously, that is an issue, and it invites all sorts of questions. The alternative, it seems to me, is much worse in the sense that it involves a situation where the government is dictating what private institutions can do in terms of speech. And I think the risks are much greater on that end of the spectrum than the alternative.
So I agree with your point completely about regarding the legal bit of this. And so let's shift this slightly from the legal, because the legal is honestly pretty black and white, frankly, with the underlying language of Section 230, which we'll get to a little bit later. But let's talk about the societal aspect of this too, because especially in the COVID environment of 2020, social media has become the de facto public square where there isn't an actual one. And so putting all of the legal aspect of Section 230 aside, there's a social obligation that we have to talk about here, I think, with respect to social media and free speech there. Because Section 230 is very clear from the legal standpoint, you're 100% correct. But there are a lot of people standing on this social argument, and they're using that social argument as a way to say, hey, we need to roll back Section 230 on this basis. What do you guys think about that? And I'll throw it over to you, Hendo, to talk about to really touch on the social aspect, because Mario hit the legal aspect very well.
Well, I think there's also a legal aspect on that as well. If you repeal 230, then it goes back to pre-230 law, which essentially has two parts. It's if you're, we'll call them platforms. If you're a platform and you do not regulate what content is on your platform, then you're going to have a lot. They call it the moderator's dilemma. If you don't regulate what's on your platform, then you're good to go. You're not liable for the third-party content that's on your platform, but you're going to have a lot of, morally objectionable stuff on your platform. Yeah. I think of 4chan as the great example of this.
Yeah, I was just going to mention
that. But then when you start to regulate, then you become liable. Then that platform starts to become liable. And what's interesting about those 1990s rulings is, I believe the wording in the rulings mentioned human moderators, not like algorithmic moderators. So that's another interesting point. I'm sorry if I didn't mention the kind of tap on the social aspect, but I think that was worth mentioning. If we're going, if
Oh, that's
for the
absolutely what you're mentioning.
So
for the
I
proponents of the
actually
repeal to
I
230.
want to take another swing at this societal point here, because I think one of the core ideas, both legally and principally, that is connected to this is the idea that if you find that there are no privately controlled forums or platforms which are available to you that suit your particular interests, that you should then go out into the free market and you should create one. And despite its quite recent difficulties, Parler is actually an excellent example of exactly that kind of platform creation, where they literally went out and created an alternative to the so-called big tech, big social media companies, and did so quite successfully. Now, obviously, very recently that has been called into question because of some very specific issues with Amazon. But that, as I understand it, as of this conversation, Parler is back online. It's just on it's no longer on the same
A different server.
no longer hosted by Amazon.
Yeah, they're being hosted by another company now. But so that brings us to a different problem, and it sort of gets us on a tangent that I don't want to get too far with, but I do want to mention it because we talk about echo chambers all the time, and it seems to me what you're describing is the market naturally creating echo chambers, and is that the best thing for society? I'm trying to drive at the ethical point of this question. Are we harming society by allowing the market to naturally create these echo chambers?
I think you're
incentivizing, not allowing the market, incentivizing the market to create
yes.
these echo chambers.
So I want to hear your answer to this question as well. But I think your question is wrong, and I'm happy for you to give what you think is your answer to the question first.
Okay, so I think we are harming society by incentivizing the creation of these echo chambers, like Parler, etc. I frankly don't know what the right answer is from an ethical standpoint regarding the regulation of speech on Facebook and Twitter. I know, in other social media sites for that matter. I know what the economics of it says and why Section 230 is important to these companies economically, which is something that we're going to discuss in a little bit. And I know what the law says. I'm not sure, and it goes back to the dilemma that Hendo pointed out. I'm not sure what the correct answer is regarding how we regulate the speech on these platforms, but I am sure that we are doing harm to our society in the long term by incentivizing the market to create these echo chamber apps for liberals and conservatives and everyone else to go to. This is the type of ground where stuff like QAnon breeds itself.
Sure.
So stuff like the Obama is the Antichrist movement of 2010 through 2016 breeds itself on these types of forums and these types of avenues. So the question is, allowing things like this to become mainstream it will lead to an increased divide in our society, which I recognize is it feels like we've already hit the basement floor in a sense. But these echo chambers are only going to exacerbate that.
Now, are you considering Facebook and Twitter these echo chamber platforms or applications as well, or just Parler and whatever 4chan or
so
something?
I think Twitter has the capability of being an echo chamber. I think Facebook less so. I think Facebook is sort of the public square arena where the people come from their echo chambers now to sort of square off. That's how I see the social media layout. People go to their echo chambers, they get indoctrinated, and then they square off against each other on Facebook. Twitter as well, but less so because you can sort of control your orbit a little bit better on Twitter. If I have a racist uncle, let's say, I can't control. I can control whether or not I see his stuff on Twitter. I can't control whether or not he sees and comments on my things on Facebook. And the way interactions on Facebook work, it's much more prone to that bombastic butting of heads.
Yeah, so again, I said a moment ago, I think your question's wrong. And really what I mean by that is I think the nature of human discourse has always inclined in the direction of creating these sorts of niche environments. And what has changed, it seems to me, is not the legal framework that has addressed or encapsulated these issues, but rather the scale and the capabilities of social media, right? So those things have necessarily eased or increased the ability of these niche environments to come into existence. But there's nothing about the legal framework which has done so. So there's nothing, even if we could go back to a pre 230 system, right, where we did have platforms resolved the moderator dilemma by not regulating content at all. The problem would still be the case that people would find their own environments, their own communities, and would have ready access to whatever crack-potted nonsense that they wanted to spread. And I don't think there's anything that we can do from a legal point of view to put that respective cat back in the bag. I think once it's out, as it, the advent of technology has made it so, there's very little that we can do to get rid of it.
Okay. I honestly, I like that answer because I frankly don't have a better one. But that leads us to really the second part of this is, so Section 230. We've talked about a lot of it, and we've talked about a little bit, and so I want to go deeper into it with respect to the language about it. Section 230, subparagraph C, or paragraph C, subparagraph 2, says that it provides these sort of companies the opportunity to regulate speech that is, quote, otherwise constitutionally protected. So the question is Section 230 constitutional?
The Supreme Court seems to think so. I mean, that seems to be the answer to the question.
What cases has the Supreme Court had against Section 230 where they've upheld it?
I don't know off the top of my head. I was not prepared with an answer to that specific question.
I didn't expect you to be.
Yeah, I don't. I'm not a Ted Cruz who recites SCOTUS decisions. Good. I hope that would get a laugh. Yeah. I don't, off the top of my head, I don't have one, but it seems, I know that it has been challenged, and I know that on the strength of the fact that it remains in effect, it seems to me that it has been upheld. But I would have to have to look at it specifically.
I was looking for challenges of Section 230 specifically earlier for constitutionality of that specific bullet, and I couldn't find any. That's why I asked. So this brings us into the next session, and I'll throw this to Hendo first, and then we'll bring it back around to you, Mario. What are, if we talk about repeal of Section 230, which was a big initiative of President Trump's, especially in his last year, which is really awkward, I think, because honestly, if Section 230 were repealed and the social media companies now bared that responsibility, we're now the owners of the content, we're now bared liability for their ownership of the content, President Trump would have been removed immediately. He would have had, Twitter and Facebook would have had no recourse. They would have had to have pulled him off almost instantaneously if Section 230 were removed.
I find your suggestion.
Possibly, there's two avenues of approach right there.
Yeah.
If Twitter all of a sudden becomes, if Twitter, if we'll just talk about Twitter for a second in this example, if 230 is repealed and Twitter has two options. They could moderate and then be liable, or they could let everything go and not be liable. So
No, they would still be liable if they let everything go. That's the part of 230 subparagraph C section 1 is that these the content owners, because social media companies own all the content that you publish on there, but they're not liable for anything that you may say through that content. And that's the principal bit of Section 230 and why President Trump wanted it repealed, because he wanted to be able to sue social media companies for libel, along with people who were attacking him on social media, because the social media companies own everything that's published on them. So President Trump wanted Section 230 repealed for that specific purpose, because he wanted to be able to sue social media companies for libel because they weren't blocking negative stories about him. And so that's an important piece here. And so, yeah, they wouldn't, social media companies, if Section 230 were repealed, wouldn't have the option essentially to not moderate. They would be required to over moderate to such a degree as to make them almost unprofitable, in my opinion.
I have to disagree with that. They from what I understand about the case law prior to 230 is that they have those two options. Is they either moderate and become liable, or they let everything go and are not liable. There was I'm trying to look it up now, but in 1995, excuse me. So
yeah. So while you're looking through that, so I think there's a very particular point that Bagley's coming to, which is that even if we accept the framework that you're offering, where there is an option where they regulate nothing and accept no responsibility, they would still, at an absolute minimum threshold, they would still be responsible for removing any incitement to violence from their platform. So at the lowest conceivable level, they would have that responsibility. So the difficulty becomes, if we accept that there is sort of a lower threshold, right? And conceptually we appreciate that there is some sort of an upper threshold. The question becomes, does the Constitution or the Supreme Court see that there is any responsibility beyond just removing incitement to violence from the platform? Can they be held liable to police slander or libel on their platform? Is that constitutionally something that they are obligated to do? Right now, under 230, the answer is no. But it's not clear that removing 230 would necessarily relieve them of that burden comprehensively. Does that answer the question?
I'm not so sure that it's so cut and dry as you make it seem to be. I'm not aware of any cases that, whether it comes to moderating or not moderating and liability versus not, not being liable. You're saying that they would be obligated to remove content that incites violence or something like that. I would agree on that, with a caveat that if they know about it. But if they don't know about it,
right? But
then they wouldn't be liable.
I think it's clear that they would be obligated to know about it. That would be part of the obligation, as I understand it, right? Because they'd be posting it. They'd be posting it on, my platform, and so therefore I'm even pre 230. I'm still responsible for it if it's an incitement to violence. So the point is,
then you're assuming that there's moderation.
No,
if they know about it, I mean, you could just have a server up essentially.
It's not about moderation per se. It's about the legal. It's the Oliver Wendell Holmes. I can't remember the actual case law. Someone's gonna have to look it up. But shouting fire in a crowded theater. So as a platform, you'd still be responsible to prevent. And forget social media, right? Rewind 50 years. A newspaper would be prohibited from taking an ad that incited violence, right? That would be prohibited under the court case. It was turn of the 20th century. Oliver Wendell Holmes was the justice. I can't remember who wrote it.
Well, that.
Um,
Sorry, continue.
No, I interrupted you in the start, so I have no right to complain if you interrupt me.
That case wouldn't apply to these internet entities, right? A newspaper has editorial discretion about what they publish and don't publish. That's why they're liable. If Mark Zuckerberg and the board at Facebook tomorrow for some whatever reason decided to stop regulate, okay, and then imagining that 230 is repealed, stop regulating or moderating their content, and then technically, according to the CompuServe, what is that case? It's a Cubby v. CompuServe in 1991. They would not be liable. But if they did moderate the content, then they would be liable. And the only way that they would be liable is if, for some reason, someone who worked at Facebook saw a post that, clearly incited violence. Then, according to that that other case, Stratton Oakmont v. Prodigy, then they would be liable because they would have known about it, right?
So my
but that
understanding,
wouldn't have, they wouldn't. That would be a really interesting situation though, because they'd have to, just essentially just come across it, since they're not moderating anyway. They just have to, probably be users and then just randomly see it.
Regardless of whether they moderate it or not, law provides that they are the owners of any content published on their website. So that's really the clear difference is they take that ownership responsibility anytime anybody publishes content there. Established law. So that's where I think Mario's newspaper scenario is really apt, because it's the difference of if Mario published an op-ed, even if I didn't necessarily agree with it, but we published it for an alternative opinion, and it ended up having something defamatory in it, our newspaper can be sued along with the writer itself.
Yes, but if it's different. Have you read the sort of like some of the literature on WV CompuServe in 1991?
I have not.
It would probably clear some of this up.
Yeah, because you have referenced a couple of specific decisions in responding to this, and I'm not familiar with that specific precedent, so I would have to examine that more carefully. But it seemed to me that was the distinction. What I was trying to distinguish was the framework that existed pre-230 versus under 230. So if in fact what you're saying is correct, I think what is interesting is that would be fundamentally a different landscape in the context of social media. Because let's just for a moment we can war game what you're describing. If we have a pre-230 app that is not moderating the content, there is no legal mechanism to prevent neo-fascist movements from organizing and disseminating information and calling for violence, etc. There would be nothing there to prevent that from happening. And even if the case law that you're describing is true and continues to be binding, I think the Supreme Court would move very quickly to rectify that situation.
Well, there would be a mechanism, because their ruling suggested that an online intermediary, like a platform, would be liable for third-party content whenever it knew or should have known, or whatever illegal, defamation or incitement to violence. So if there were users who newspaper reporters, journalists, if they clearly, said, hey, Parler, there are these, characters on your website who are, saying, hey, let's go to the White House and burn it down on the 20th, then it seems to me that they would be clearly liable, since if they did not act to take it down, or alert authorities or whatever, what have you.
So I've been shouting a lot. So I'll make this point and then leave it up to the two of you to sort of address this question. But it seems to me that if you're accepting that framework of either things they knew or should have known, I think the language of that is going to be so broad that eventually they will necessarily be moderating, which was the point that Bagley and I had made much earlier. If you say they ought to have known because it's on their platform, then that's not substantively different from the suggestion that we were making 10 minutes ago.
Yeah. Okay. So then there's the interesting point I think is interesting about the moderating. So once you get into the I agree with you. A lot of these companies aren't going to want to have like cesspools, like massive, Mark Zuckerberg probably doesn't want 4chan, or excuse me, doesn't want Facebook to turn into like a 4chan chat room or however that stuff works. So when they do start moderating, sorry, shit, I just lost my train of thought. Oh my God.
You want to say?
Oh, so when they do start moderating, and since it largely operates by algorithms now, the case law pre-230 mentions humans who moderate. So now imagine a newspaper, like if you submitted an opinion piece, a letter to the editor to your local newspaper, they probably have a pretty small staff, and they're probably not getting a lot of letters to the editor, right? If you're like in a town where I live, a pretty small town. So they're moderating and editing out, maybe like, we'll say just like 100 letters to the editor per month. Well, Facebook probably has about 1 billion posts per month, we'll say. That's an imagine posting and then having to wait for confirmation that your post, doesn't make them liable for defamation or literally insert whatever legal action. That would be insane.
Yes, and that was sort of my point whenever I first brought this topic up, is if that were the case, it would make these sorts of platforms economically unfeasible.
Yeah.
So I would hasten to add at this point, even if that's true, even if it means the end of Twitter and Facebook, speaking only for myself, I will shed no tears. I'm okay with Facebook and Twitter disintegrating into a pile of ashes, quickly to be swept away by the tide. I'm okay with that. I'm not at all going to grieve the loss of these, massive ad-producing, ad-selling organizations. So I won't. Many people will. I accept that. Many people will be upset about that. Myself, I will not.
So then, what is the public square to you? Is the internet or platforms on the internet any part of that at all?
For me, no. I think that if you, I'm very fundamentalist about this idea of privately controlled platforms being allowed to make editorial decisions. I think that is critically important, because I am deathly afraid of giving that editorial control over to a government entity. I think that is a horrendously dangerous outcome. And I'm willing, quite frankly, to allow, Jeff Bezos, for example, to make decisions which produce censorship, because I think that's a superior alternative to, giving Mitch McConnell that authority.
How about not on the legal sense, but just on the ethical sense, as I think Bags was probably trying to get me to answer about 20 minutes ago.
Yeah.
I was trying to get both of you to answer it 20 minutes ago.
So like the, so
well, if I refuse to answer it 20 minutes ago, there's no reason for me to answer it now.
Oh, no, that was me. I think the question was directed at me.
I'm not going to start changing the habits of a lifetime by answering questions. No.
Should they feel ethically obligated to allow speech that, is protected under the First Amendment, but, it's still rude or, obscene?
Again, I would say no. My own answer to that would be no. I think that if Facebook, let's imagine some hypothetical theoretical organization that wants to host a social media platform, and their only thing they're targeting as a demographic is single mothers, right?
Mm-hmm.
They should be allowed to say, this content, Mario is producing this content that is designed explicitly to anger our core demographic, and we want to remove that content. I think that is a critical component of their ethical and societal responsibility, is to be able to say, look, the platform that we're serving, the demographic that we're serving, has these qualities that we want to preserve, even though those are not necessarily directly correspondent with the First Amendment.
Okay, I think I should frame it a little bit differently then. Okay, so you're talking about anything, but let's focus on these humongous, like Facebook has, I think, over 3 billion users or something like that. Might even be more. They're so massive. I mean, we'll say probably a majority of Americans have Facebook accounts. If I had to guess, they are so massive that you don't think that an organization that big would sort of feel ethically bound to, open up their platform to, more. Just, I guess we'll just go under like the purview of the First Amendment, but
yeah.
Then on top of that, shit.
So wait, while you're thinking of how to frame that, again, I'm going to be really boring because I keep repeating the same basic idea. Would you think it would be good? Would you think it would be better for society or worse for society? Because my own personal view is that we should not expect any organization to have ethics in a capitalist system. That is not an expectation that we should have. That's my fundamental view, is there is no such thing. So companies, Facebook, NBC, I mean, basically any company that operates in the United States, as in a for-profit capacity, has that as their primary motivation.
Mm-hmm.
And I challenge you to imagine a corporation that will place its ethical framework in front of its bottom line, and I will show you a company that's on its way out or has already closed. So it's not a practical expectation that you should have in a capitalist society. That's my answer. Again, I realize my answers keep hitting the same notes,
okay.
So I'm happy for both of you
Bags
to say what you think here.
I largely agree with you. I'm just sort of asking these, prodding.
So
Bags,
I'm going to add to that and say that I also agree with that larger point. I use the same answer whenever I debate with conservatives a lot about whether or not there's bias in the media and whether or not that bias is intentional, etc. The media, every single media source we have, with the exception of NPR, is a business, and they are designed to own a market space, and they will curate their content that they produce for you, tailored towards that market space. And so, and this is a lot of things. Whenever we roll back the what was that act in 1987 that Reagan did not renew, that allowed media companies to do post opinion as fact, or spin opinion as fact. I cannot remember the name of that act.
Well, Hendo's looking. Keep talking. Finish your point.
Okay. In any case, social media companies are the same from that perspective. Like you were illustrating earlier, all these companies own a market share, and we should expect them to be able to tailor their business to that space in the market that they have. Hendo, do you have the name of that?
So it looks like it was the elimination of the FCC fairness doctrine.
Fairness doctrine. Yes, that's it.
Introduced in 1949, and then the FCC eliminated the policy in 1987.
So this isn't a direct step from one to the other, but now that the FCC has been introduced to the conversation, I would just hasten to add that I think the decision to remove net neutrality as a standing principle is really directly connected to the kinds of problems that I think we're trying to discuss here. I think that the best possible outcome that we can hope for comes from a set of clear, nonpartisan guardrails, right, that we would place on all content platforms. I keep saying content providers, but all platforms and forums that apply universally across the board. And the issue is that we have to be very, very careful. We remain upright on the horse and not fall either too far in one extreme or the other, because the issue is if we lean too far in the direction of regulation, indeed over-regulation, the problem then becomes the government dictating speech. And if you fall on the other side of the horse, you allow companies like Amazon to just remove any content from the internet that they find objectionable. So we have to find some sort of an intermediate space between those two extremes, it seems to me. No?
Okay, so this sort of rounds out where I wanted to take this topic. I thought this was a really good discussion on a lot of the finer points here. I don't know that we necessarily drilled into the ethics of the public square, especially in 2020 with the pandemic and the elimination of sort of actual public squares, forums for people to gather. But I mean, I think we. It's sort of a very difficult question to try and wrap around, and I think we got a lot of really good content out of this, frankly.
All right, well, I want to poke this then. I mean, if you think there's more to say about the ethical framework of free speech and social media, hit it. I mean, this is all digital, so there's no analog film that we're going to run out of. So say your piece here.
Well, so no, I think that it's a really difficult distinction to make between the public square and private enterprise in an era where private enterprise has become the public square because of COVID-19 restrictions specifically, but the use of social media more broadly. My point largely is that social media has become a de facto public square, and our public square itself has taken on a secondary interest. I don't know how we reestablish that balance, but I think it's important to at least acknowledge that shift has been made, and our society now treats social media, if not from a legal perspective, then from a societal perspective, treats social media as if it were the public square. Also, arguably from an economic perspective as well, treat social media as if it were the public square. Advertisers don't run to billboards anymore. They run to social media companies because that's where the eyeballs are. So from that perspective, I think we would be remiss if we didn't really sort of fundamentally churn that idea around that. As our society has evolved in the last, really, let's say 4 to 8 years, social media has become what the public square was in the 1900s.
So is it, just to be very clear on this point, is it your perspective that we have an ethical obligation to preserve or protect the public square elements which exist in a de facto way on social media?
I think we have yes. I think we have an obligation to preserve those elements, at least. And I think Section 230 goes a long way to do that, frankly. I don't know where the line should be drawn on social media with speech, quite frankly. Um, but I do know that if we continue to, if we start to over moderate, we run the risk of losing what is effectively our last public square. Uh, because outside of social media, people don't have, and we talked about this earlier with the compartmentalization and Parler and things like that.
Yeah.
Outside of Facebook and Twitter in particular, people don't have debate anymore. And even on those websites, even if it's sort of a nasty argument, you're still being presented with alternative views. You're not in your own particular universe.
Alternative. Yeah. So let me strike really at the heart of this point, right? You made a very specific claim that I think invites a further question. You said this is the last public forum, right? Now, I submit to you that the public forum as it exists, right? The social media, the Twitters, the Facebooks of the world are by definition the space with the greatest participation. But that doesn't necessarily mean it is the last breath of it, in the sense that all of the previous forums, and platforms that existed still exist and continue to exist. And if tomorrow Facebook and Twitter and all these other social media companies fell into a crevice in the crust, we would still have mechanisms, and we as human beings would seek out those other alternative mechanisms. Just as a trivial example, like the one we're using to record right now to have conversations about the substance of these issues. So I think this suggestion that social media has some sort of a special right just because everyone is using them at the moment, I think that really deserves to be challenged.
So let me rephrase then what my point was, because yes, you're right. Those things would all substantively continue to exist, but Americans continue to drift further from one another. Right? We see it geographically as well as in our presentations online and with each other, etc. Right? So as when I talk about the death of the public square and as the social media companies are sort of our last bastion of it. Say we take Facebook and Twitter away, and we continue to have these echo chambers that we have. But now the society you live in is also an echo chamber, because I live in a city, and I go to bars with people who think like I think, in areas that look like I look, and people from my hometown an hour away that live in the middle of a cornfield. They go to bars with people who think like they think and look like they look. And if that becomes the de facto public square in the event of a breakdown of the social media complex, then we only hasten the echo chambering of our society.
So statistically, or no, not statistically, excuse me, historically, that has not been the case, because historically, if you think back to pre-social media, what happens is that if someone came into a bar, even a bar of like-minded individuals, and said, "I think the president was born in Africa," right? What would happen is that person would be ridiculed, and what the consequence that we should bear in mind is that the advent of social media and the access of people, 3 billion people all over the world, to one another, meant that one crackpotted person suddenly had access to thousands of other people who was just as ill-equipped to deal with reality as they were. And that created the echo chamber that you were describing. So it seems to me that in reality, the destruction of these global marketplaces of ideas is, if anything, going to make the kind of niche environments that you're describing more difficult to inhabit, because you're going to have to share, in many cases, physical space with people who think differently from you.
not as we drift away from each other as a society, though. The concentration of liberal voters in cities and Republican voters in rural areas really goes to determine that point. And
Yeah,
it's more hyper concentrated in these areas than it has been throughout our history as a nation.
So the problem is
I know you were going to add something.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. 2 seconds, and then I'll shut up again. The state of California had more Republican voters than most of the national South, or the national Southeast, I should say. And so we should be careful about being too certain of the geographic polarization that you're describing. I'll shut up and let other people
say that again. Sorry, Mario. What I just googled something.
The state of California has more Republican voters than most of the national Southeast. Right, the area that we think of as this great red area, the red belt, has fewer Republican voters than the state of California.
But the entire Bible Belt, that's what you're saying?
No, I'm not saying the entire. I'm saying the two populations. On one hand, we have
California,
the Bible Belt, and the other hand, we have California. I'm saying the total number of Republican voters in both places is not as enormous as the would be implied by Bagley's assertion that we have this geographic polarization, because we still have in states like I'm in New York, right? We're a blue state in the sense that we have an a greater number of Democratic voters than otherwise, but we still have an absolutely enormous number of Republican voters.
No,
so we are not.
I don't think he's meaning. He's meaning he's talking probably. I'm assuming about the big sort, the rural and suburban and urban divide that's been going on since at least the 70s, late 60s.
Yeah, exactly. And so
that is a geographical divide.
That's what I'm trying to break into here is the rural urban divide, because as liberal voters concentrate in urban areas and they go to bars in urban areas and do things in urban areas around people like them, and rural people exist who are more conservative exist primarily in rural areas, go to bars with other people who think the same way as them. In these old public squares, we lose this intermixing of ideas because people have naturally coalesced themselves around people who are like them. You made the point about New York. Yeah, New York has a lot of Republican voters. How many Republican voters exist in Manhattan?
It's a fair number. I would have to look it up, but it's not a small number.
Well, so, certainly, again, proportionally though.
Proportionally, it's definitely smaller than in other areas, but I mean, it's still a significant. Again, the point is a good one. I'm not going to take the ridiculous point of arguing against the idea of polarization. I'm just trying to be clear. I think the notion, the suggestion that the death of social media will remove the areas where people are able to interact with individuals they otherwise would not have access to is wrong if we were talking about it in a comprehensive sense. And the other point of it is, to the extent that it is true, it reflects the environment that existed pre-230, right? It describes what was taking place before social media, because that was the state of affairs.
I think social media is making that divide worse anyway, as someone who lives in a rural area.
Yeah, and that was the argument I tried to make, apparently not very successfully, 10 minutes ago, is that we see that the social media has allowed people to find other people who are just as wrong as they are, and to coalesce into groups, put dumb Q stickers all over their faces. And so they have an audience, a ready-made audience for people who are just as wrong.
Well, they can tune into this podcast.
All right, so I think that puts a nice little I think that puts a nice little ribbon on our discussion for today. So we'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. If you tuned in for our first ever podcast show, whatever we're going to call this, next time we promise will be more interesting. We'll have beers for everyone, all that fun stuff.
No, do not.
And next,
we're going to give everyone beer. That is going to be very.
No, all of us. We'll have beers for everyone participating in the active conversation. Everyone watching will have to grab their own beer. All right, so that sort of puts a bow on everything we really wanted to talk about here. I feel like we've had a lot of good discussion. So next time we're going to be talking about President Biden's first 100 days in office, what that looks like from both the domestic and foreign policy perspective, and what we can sort of expect to come out of that and level set with it. So for Brian Henderson, for Mario Mascaro, I'm Josh Bagley, and we will see you next time on The Dry Club.